Hello everybody, and welcome back to a very special segment on my YouTube channel called Jonas Brothers News Hour. So I did my first Taylor Swift News Hour about a month ago, decoding her music video, and I thought, why don't we bring it full circle? Why don't we do a Jonas Brothers News Hour? Because we have some very important things to talk about today. Specifically, the Chasing Happiness Amazon Prime original movie, Jonas Brothers documentary. As a true Jonas Brothers stan since 2006 when I was 10 years old, I feel very personally invested in the Jonas Brothers comeback, and specifically this documentary that I just happened to watch last night. And I just wanted to give my thoughts and a review and a reaction to let you know kind of my perspective as someone who knows everything about the Jonas Brothers since I was 10 years old because they were my entire life. So when I heard that the Jonas Brothers were getting back together a few months ago, I was extremely ecstatic. I very often throughout the years will listen to Jonas Brothers songs. They are regularly on my playlist. I can never get over Burnin' Up. It's truly one of the best songs of our generation. SOS, amazing. The Jonas Brothers really helped shape I feel the Gen Z generation, and it's just, we're so lucky to have experienced them in their prime. So I've been waiting in anticipation of this documentary to come out, and I will say, it was a great documentary, okay? I quite enjoyed watching it. I loved seeing their growth. I loved seeing, them talk about their prime, everything like that. But I will say, I think this documentary was catered towards the general public who were not Jonas Brothers stans in their prime of, 2006 to 2009, and more of the public now who's experiencing them kind of for the first time firsthand, just to kind of give them a general synopsis. Because I found a lot of factoids that were left out of this documentary that I feel a little upset that they didn't talk about, because I know what really went down with the whole Jonas Brothers phenomenon from, 11-year-old perspective. And I will also say that this documentary kind of shifted who is my number one Joe bro. You feel me? You feel me? Comment down below if this documentary has shifted who you see as your favorite, because I'm about to get into it, okay? So first off, I will say that the documentary, I feel like, was shot very dramatically. I feel like even the smallest things they were trying to make very dramatic, and overall, I'm like, okay, this is a documentary about a teen boy band who is now, reunited. It's not the end of the world. So I feel like it was a little dramatic, like maybe the filmmaker, the director has experience producing really dramatic documentaries. I felt like it was a little too dramatic in some points, and it could have been a little more, lighthearted. I also felt that they spent a good majority of the movie talking specifically about their childhood and everything leading up to the Jonas Brothers. And I felt like although it is a great building foundation for the documentary and had some great information in there, I felt like it could have been condensed a little more, because I would have liked to seen more of a focus on what happened during their actual popular years as the Jonas Brothers, because it's actually quite interesting when you think back on it. They really were only huge for about 3 years. I would say end of 2006 through 2009 is when they were really at their prime. When you look back on it, it's interesting because other Disney stars at the time, let's say Hannah Montana, Miley Cyrus, were huge for, maybe closer to 5 years. So I think it would have been a lot more interesting if they really focused in on those years and what specifically happened in those years, because they talked a lot about their childhood, growing up, what happened leading up to the Jonas Brothers, Nick being on Broadway, Joe ending up auditioning and stuff. And then they talked a lot about the really beginning stages of the Jonas Brothers. So I would say the overall documentary, 60% was talking about their upbringing and the beginning years before they were signed by Disney. and only 30% were talking about like the actual years of the Joe Bros being huge, and then like 10% was talking about like the aftermath. But I would have liked to have seen a lot more talking in it. There are some points that I felt like they majorly left out of the documentary that were really transformative points of the Jonas Brothers. So for example, so they finally talk about how they got signed by Disney and how they moved out to LA, and they had shot the Year 3000 music video when they were with Columbia Records, but Columbia never released it. And then so when they moved to Disney, Disney ended up releasing the music video on Disney Channel. And so even though it was shot a little bit earlier, they were just now releasing it, and people were going crazy over it. So, and then they were talking about while they were releasing it, the Jonas Brothers were actually in Canada filming Camp Rock. And they talked about how Joe was originally offered the role for Camp Rock, but then they all ended up going. And then, so while they were in Canada was when they were really blowing up in the States. And then they talked about how they came back from Canada to do a show, and they had like 50,000 people there. What I didn't see them talk about really was the creation of their album. That was their first big album, because you have to remember, they actually had an album in 2006 that came out. It was either like 2005 or 2006, and it was their very first album. Year 3000 was on it, but like all of the other songs weren't like any like huge Jonas Brothers songs. I think that song Mandy was on it, but other than that, like it wasn't really considered like their huge album. But then once they switched to Disney in 2007, they released their album that had SOS, Hold On. And I also would have thought it'd be interesting to address the fact that Year 3000 was actually on both albums. And it would have been interesting to address the fact that Year 3000 was actually a song that was recorded by a British boy band in the early 2000s, like 2001, 2002. And then they suddenly got the rights to play it, because I actually didn't know that until a few years ago. But anyway, so yeah, 2007 was when that album came out with SOS and Hold On and Good Night and Goodbye and all of those big Jonas Brothers hits. Now, they talked a little bit about the fact that they were on a Hannah Montana episode, but they mentioned Miley for literally 5 seconds, and how then Nick was like suddenly like smitten and was writing songs about love. But what I didn't like was that they didn't talk about the fact that they went on tour with Hannah Montana, because this is, especially like as someone who directly experienced this as a child growing up in the Disney phenomenon, I can say firsthand that the Jonas Brothers really blew up when they were associated with Hannah Montana, because if you don't know, Hannah Montana was truly the biggest phenomenon in female children in that time period. If you watch the Hannah Montana Best of Both Worlds concert tour, you will really get to experience like what it was like. It was like nothing that will ever compare, I think, for a long time. It was Disney's, you know, #1 hit like ever, and nothing really will ever compare to that kind of phenomenon, because you know, it was this girl who had a TV show, lived a double life. She was a pop star, and then she actually sang in real life, and they did the whole concert tour where it was like meet Miley and Hannah at the same time. And you know, dads were doing competitions, running in heels to get their kids tickets. Like tickets sold out immediately because scalpers bought them all. And then, you know, tickets were going for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars. And Miley even went on to do a second leg of the tour because so many shows sold out like immediately. And the Jonas Brothers actually went on tour and was her opening act. And they actually did the song We Got the Party with Hannah Montana, because that was her song, and then they came on it, they did that song in the episode, and then they did it on tour with her. Because the Best of Both Worlds tour started, I believe, late summer, early fall 2007, and then ran through early 2008. So 2007 was really the year that they blew up, and I know it's because of the direct correlation with Hannah Montana, because they first came out on Disney Channel in 2006 with the Year 3000, and then they had like SOS in the beginning of the year, and yeah, it was like, oh cool, the Jonas Brothers. But as soon as they were on that Hannah Montana episode, and as soon as they were touring with Hannah Montana and Nick was linked with Miley, that was when they blew up. And I thought it was interesting that they didn't even mention the fact at all. They didn't even say they went on tour with Hannah Montana, because they didn't go on their own headlining tour until after the Hannah Montana tour. So they really, in this documentary, just said, you know, we went from playing shows to, you know, a few hundred, few thousand people to all of a sudden like selling out arenas. And it's like, but you missed that big, huge stepping stone of time when you went on tour with Hannah Montana, which the Hannah Montana tour during that time was the biggest tour of the decade. So I didn't understand why they didn't talk about that at all, and why they didn't talk a little bit more about the whole Miley and Nick drama, because that whole drama within their dynamic and their relationship also really helped them, like both of their careers, because kids were so invested in it. And then they didn't even talk about really, you know, the whole Nick and Selena thing. And I get that it's like, that's not really about their relationships at all. But in a sense it is, because it's all of those moving parts that happened with Nick being linked to different people, with Joe dating Demi Lovato. Like, they didn't even talk about that. Like, all of those moving parts really helped propel them in their fame, because really at the time, you know, they didn't have a Disney Channel show yet, and really like the royalty of Disney Channel and who was like the biggest child stars were the ones that had TV shows and were singing. So I thought that was interesting that they didn't talk about that at all. And then also when they released Burning Up was definitely their hottest song ever. And I thought it was interesting that they didn't specifically talk about the song. Like they showed little snippets of the music video, but they didn't talk about how it was really like the blow up song of the summer for kids in 2008. They also, I don't think, talked enough about how like Nick wrote so much, and how like Nick wrote the song a little bit longer about his diabetes, and how like a lot of kids related to that. And then they didn't talk about Camp Rock 2. They didn't talk about touring with Demi Lovato, which I thought was very interesting. I also thought it was very interesting when Nick said that his biggest regret was doing the second season of Jonas, and that they thought that it hindered them from growing and that it wasn't their brand. I was really taken aback by that statement, because the Jonas Brothers were a Disney brand, okay? Like, yes, when they first started in like 2005, they weren't, and they were more like a rock band. But Disney picked them up, and Disney is what made them who they were. Like, no one knew about the Jonas Brothers in terms of an international platform before they went on the Disney Channel. So their whole brand was the Disney Channel. All of their music videos aired on Disney. They did the collabs with Hannah Montana. They were on Camp Rock, which was a Disney movie that was huge at the time. They did the Disney Channel Summer Games every summer. They were on Disney Channel commercials. Everything they did was Disney. Their whole brand was Disney. Their whole fan base was children. So they tried to say like the Jonas show was appealing to 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Yeah, that's correct, because that's who your whole fan base was. They were like, it felt like we were really taken aback, and the whole reason of doing Jonas at the time was to keep us more relevant in our brand. And they were like, but I feel like it hindered our brand. And I feel like that's the furthest thing from the truth. I can say that as a kid at the time, Jonas came out, I don't know the exact date, but I know it was probably like 2009-ish, because it was definitely after like Hannah Montana tour and everything like that. It was like they were a little bit older, and it was after a little bit longer album. And it was definitely like a fun show to watch, like, because this whole time, being such a Jonas Brothers fan, they were never on a TV show on Disney Channel, which, all of our favorite Disney stars and the biggest stars appealing to children at the time were Hannah Montana, Miley Cyrus had a show, Demi Lovato had a show, Selena Gomez had a show. So finally it was like, oh my gosh, the Jonas Brothers have a show. So Jonas season 1 was great, and then they came out with Jonas season 2, which was Jonas LA, which I believe came out during the summer. And again, like, kids loved it. And was it the best show on Disney? No. Obviously the best show was like Hannah Montana, Wizards of Waverly Place, but it was still a great show to watch and to feel more connected to the Jonas Brothers. So I don't get what they were meaning when they said like it hindered our brand, because your brand this whole time had always been kids. Like, all of your fans and everyone who came to your concerts, like, were all children and preteens. It wasn't any like young adults who were really listening to your music. So your whole brand was revolved around Disney. And I do think that it was important, because it wasn't until I would say like 2010, 2011, where all of the fans who were 10, 11, 12 years old growing up with them were starting to go into high school and become a little more mature, and that's when it would have been more of a switch for them to kind of start refocusing their music a little bit. So in 2009 they came out with Lines, Vines, and Trying Times, which I thought was very interesting that again they didn't really talk about that album. All they said in reference to that album was when they were in the studio and Kevin was like, we have to be realistic and think that this album might not be as huge, it's a little bit longer, which was completely true. I think that nothing will ever compare to the phenomenon that was 2007 and 2008 in terms of Disney Channel and Hannah Montana and the Jonas Brothers. But in 2009, they came out with that album. I thought it was interesting that they didn't even talk about the fact that they did the collab with Miley Cyrus, which was a huge propelling force again for that album and for their tour, because then they even performed Nick and Miley on stage, and it was kind of about their breakup and everything like that. So I don't get why they didn't talk about that, because again, that was a huge selling point for their album. And then they all of a sudden just jumped from it being such a crazy phenomenon and then being mobbed everywhere and everything like that to all of a sudden like starting to drift apart. So they really missed that phase of the 2009 album, and then they jumped straight into Kevin getting his reality show and the other brothers not wanting to be on it, which looking back on it, I didn't get that vibe at all, because a lot that was focused on the show, I believe that show came out in like 2012, was revolved around them making the song Pom Poms. And I thought it was interesting that they didn't hardly talk about that. Like they mentioned that they had like an album that they ended up not releasing, but I thought it was interesting that they didn't talk about the fact that a lot of that show was focused around them making the album and recording the Pom Poms music video. And then all of a sudden, like it just never happened. Like Nick Jonas, again, wrote a song about Miley Cyrus called Wedding Bells that he performed on tour one time. And it was about like, because Miley and Liam had just gotten engaged in 2012, and he wrote a song about like their relationship, and he had references to their own anniversaries and how he doesn't want to, hear wedding bells and doesn't want to like see that happen. And they didn't talk about that at all. So, and then they all of a sudden jumped to their breaking up, which I thought was interesting because looking back on it, there was definitely such a huge disconnect between like 2009, 2010 to 2012. They weren't making any music. Nick Jonas had his Nick Jonas in the Administration. Joe Jonas had his own album, and everyone knew something was up. Like as a fan, you just weren't as connected anymore. Like I said, it's really weird that they were really just a huge phenomenon for really like 2 or 3 years, and after that they slowly started teetering off. And again, I think that's attributed to they're kind of like phasing out of Disney and their fan base growing up a little bit. But their fan base still was, teenagers. So if they really would have capitalized on that more, I think they took too big of a gap in trying to release another album, because the last album they released was 2009, and they didn't attempt to release another album until 2012, and they never even ended up releasing it. So it was that time period when they were doing like their kind of side projects where no one really connected with them. Like I remember Nick Jonas had a song Who I Am, which I thought was good with the Administration, but like I didn't like the rest of the album. Like it wasn't the same, like it wasn't the Jonas Brothers. And then Joe Jonas had his song See No More, which I thought was good, but it wasn't the Jonas Brothers, and I didn't listen to the rest of the album. So I thought it was really interesting. Like they talked a little bit about their side projects, and they talked about Joe saying that it didn't end up like doing as well as he thought it would, but they didn't talk too much about like that time period. And then they kind of talked about the fact like they broke up, and Nick was the one who wanted to break up, and it definitely made, like throughout this documentary, like I was a Nick Jonas stan as a child. Like Nick was my favorite. Like everyone had a famous Jonas brother, and Nick was my favorite. But through this documentary and just like the way that he was talking about things and the way he was acting, and knowing that he was the one who really broke up the band because he wanted to do all his own, like side projects, really kind of just shifted the dynamic for me. And now I actually like Joe a lot more. I just like his personality a little more. Like it seems like Nick is more like, I don't know if it's true now, but he seems a little more absorbed in it, whereas Joe and Kevin seem a lot more like down to earth and really just loved doing it and loved being a brother band and like loved the process. whereas Nick was more like loving the fame, it seemed like. So yeah, I think now I am a Joe stan, so. And then they talked about then last year in 2018 coming back together, and I thought it was really interesting that they said they really hadn't seen each other in 6 years, which I never would have thought because, you know, as Kevin had his children, like they would post Instagram photos every now and again, you know, with each other. So I would have thought that everything was fine, but I think it was more so like they went out and saw the kids because, you know, it's their nieces. But beyond that, they didn't spend any time together, which I thought was really interesting and I never knew. And then I also thought it was interesting that they didn't talk about Nick dating Olivia Culpo, which she was Miss Universe at the time when they were dating, which again helped kind of propel Nick into his own solo career, because then he wrote Jealous about her, which was his biggest song, and it was like, oh my gosh, he wrote about Olivia Culpo because she's Miss Universe, and they didn't talk about that at all, and I get it, like he's married now, so they don't want to like dwell on past relationships, but there were so many moving parts that helped propel solo success. And then also when they only talked about DNCA, Joe's band, for like 2 seconds, I was like, why didn't they talk about it a little bit more, like what's happening with the band now that the Joe Bros are back together? Like obviously it was suddenly just like, oh, I'm abandoning that band. Like they didn't really talk about that enough. They also didn't talk about Kevin's businesses that he started, which I thought was interesting. Like they made it seem like Kevin was just kind of like doing nothing for 6 years when he started a construction business and he invested in a bunch of apps, and he really is, you know, excelling as a businessman. So they didn't talk about that at all, which I thought was interesting. And then they just talked about like coming back together, and they're like, oh, we're gonna spend all this time together. And then I also thought that was interesting that they didn't talk about at all about like the creation of the new music, which I thought would have been a focus on, like them getting back into the studio, like who, you know, did the most writing, like how is the dynamic of the band now? I feel like there were just so many holes in the movie, things they didn't talk about that I know as a Jonas Brothers fan for 10 plus years, and then things that I would have wanted to know right now. I feel like it was all just, you know, this was our childhood, this was how we started becoming the Jonas Brothers. Oh, we were famous for, like, they talked about that for 10 minutes, and then like, okay, now we want to get the band back together. And they didn't really talk about all the stuff in between, which I thought was disappointing. But like I said, it was still a great movie, but I feel like it was definitely catered more towards people who are coming into them now as the general public, like listening to them on the radio, and not anyone who was really a fan of them since day one, which I thought was disappointing. This was kind of like just a crash course in the Jonas Brothers, like the very like base level facts, and not anything that like true fans would want to know, which I think is interesting because now in 2019, like the reason that they have adult fans right now is because everyone who is a child fan is now an adult. And I think it's interesting to think about the fact that like people who are going to be buying their album and going and buying tickets to their shows are, I would say, majorly the people who have been fans of them since the beginning and were kids at the time, and now are finally adults and more mature. And I think it's less of people who weren't fans of them at the time and were older, like older teenagers or adults back then, because like, for example, my older sisters, they weren't really fans of the Jonas Brothers back then. I mean, like one of my sisters liked them because I did and like would listen to them with me, but like she's not the person who's gonna be buying tickets to their concert right now. I am, for example. Like, so I think it's just interesting that they didn't try to cater more towards like their diehard fans, and did more of like base level, like this is who we are, you know, in case you didn't know who we were. But yeah, so I wish they would have gone a little more in depth. Synopsis, I'm now a Joe fan, less of a Nick fan. I also think justice for Kevin. He's really left out of a lot of things throughout their whole career and everything. It seems like he really got the short end of the stick. I also thought it was interesting how they only mentioned Frankie once. Like all they said was, oh, Frankie was conceived in this house. They didn't talk about the fact that they had a younger brother this whole time who was like, you know, going on tour with them and, you know, being there for them. I don't know. I just thought, you know, justice for Frankie. So yeah, if you haven't watched it, go watch it. I think it's worth watching, but again, maybe now that you know all of these facts that I just told you, you'll be a little more vigilant and you're watching and be like, oh yeah, why didn't they say that? Why didn't they say that? But overall, I thought it was a great movie, but also a little disappointing. So I hope you liked this Jonas Brothers News Hour. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel down below. I would love that. I post videos a lot, fashion videos, you know, entertainment videos, beauty videos, anything like that. But again, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!